Washington, D.C. wore its grief like a tightly buttoned coat. At dawn, a hush blanketed the marble city, thick as the clouds overhead. News broke with 5 sterile words that echoed louder than any siren. Senator Harold Lancaster dies at 78. The effect was immediate. The Capitol itself seemed to exhale and brace. The flag above its dome, a silent sentinel of history, was lowered to half-mast by midday. Beneath it, reporters gathered like crows, their breath visible in the chill, microphones clenched like weapons. Somewhere in the middle of that morning fog stood a woman in a navy coat, alone in her office, watching it all. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett didn't cry. She couldn't. Not here. Not now. She had walked these hallways with quiet purpose for years. A former public defender, she had earned her seat not with wealth, not with backroom deals, but with blistered feet, hard truths, and the unwavering conviction that justice didn't need to shout, it just had to show up. Senator Lancaster had been more than a mentor. He had been a compass, a bridge between generations, and in a chamber built on performance, he had chosen to listen. Even in silence, he had seen her. And now, his seat, the one he held for nearly 3 decades, was empty. But not untouched. The whispers began before the ink had dried on the obituary. By noon, a conservative bloc had released a thinly veiled joint statement. This is not the time for coronations based on identity or media narratives. The American people deserve stability, not activism. No names. But everyone knew who they meant. Jasmine Crockett, too young, too bold, too black. The networks turned it into sport. News anchors dissected her past with surgical glee. Protest photos from college, videos of her cross-examining federal judges. Headlines read like warning labels. She's no herald. And yet, something deeper was stirring. Because Jasmine hadn't asked for the spotlight. But now, she was standing in it. The email came stamped in red, urgent. She opened it with the same calm she used in hearings, methodical, composed. But when she saw the name on the appointment to chair the vetting committee, her jaw locked. Clint Eastwood. The Clint Eastwood. Former mayor, living legend, political ghost. He hadn't walked the halls of Washington in 2 decades. He had outlived endorsements, outlasted presidents, and quietly declined every call to return. Until now, she muttered under her breath, not to anyone, just to the room. They're bringing in a cowboy to judge my worth. This wasn't about balance. It was about optics. Eastwood was the system's last weapon, myth-turned-man. Unimpeachable, unbothered, and utterly immune to charm. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She knew what this was. They wanted distance, not direction. They wanted an arbiter no one could accuse, a symbol old enough to have built the system, yet far enough removed not to be entangled in its present corruption. They think I can't reach him, she told Leah, her chief of staff. Leah only shrugged. He's not playing their game. Jasmine turned toward the window. No, he'll play his. That night, news anchors called it, the return of the legend. They played black and white footage of Clint shaking hands in mayoral debates, slow-motion clips of him walking into town halls alone, sleeves rolled up, face unreadable. The voiceovers said, wise, and neutral. Jasmine knew better. He wasn't neutral. He was silent, and silence was a decision. The jet touched down at sunset. No red carpet, no reporters. Clint Eastwood stepped off with a weathered coat, boots worn at the edges, and a hat that looked like it had survived 1,000 storms. He moved like fog, quiet, inevitable. Inside the Capitol, aides whispered. Some didn't recognize him. Others looked like they'd seen a ghost. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He walked straight to the holding room where the committee had been preparing. Senator Nathaniel Park waited for him. We needed someone not playing for a side, Park said, offering a hand. Clint shook it once, then sat before the pleasantries could pile up. Everyone's playing for something, he muttered. Park leaned in, whispering like a man already fearing the fire he had lit. She scares them, Crockett. They think she's the spark that'll burn this place down. Clint sipped black coffee. And you want me to put it out? We want you to see if she's ready." Clint looked out the window where the Capitol glowed like a shrine built for gods no one prayed to anymore. And then, without looking back, he said what would echo in the silence long after the hearing. "Am I here to shut her down, or see her through?" The room didn't answer, but Washington already had. Room 142 of the Hart Senate office building felt colder than usual. It wasn't the air conditioning. It was the weight of anticipation. Political operatives, aides, and strategists filled the seats, their expressions curated, disinterest disguising deep calculation. The moment Jasmine Crockett entered, every pair of eyes turned. She walked in alone, no entourage, no performance, just a navy blue suit, a plain notepad, and the steady resolve of someone who had already been forged by fire. Clint Eastwood was already seated, center of the committee arc, expression carved from stone. He didn't look at her. Not yet. She took her seat and opened her folder like it was a shield. The committee chair cleared his throat. "Congresswoman Crockett, you have the floor." Jasmine leaned into the mic. Calm, even. She didn't thank them for the opportunity. She didn't offer pleasantries. She spoke about the crumbling schools in her district. The mothers who worked 3 jobs to afford medicine. The boy who died waiting for a heater repair in public housing during a Texas freeze. She stitched her speech with the Constitution, quotes from Baldwin, nods to Lincoln, but she never wavered from the people who had sent her here. She wasn't performing, she was testifying. When she finished, no one clapped. No one dared. The silence that followed was not discomfort, it was reckoning. Then, Clint moved, one hand on the table, one hand on the cane. He leaned forward. "Nice words," he said, voice like gravel over granite. Then, "What have you done?" The question hit like a fist in velvet. Jasmine didn't flinch, but her fingers tightened. She opened her mouth, and the real hearing began. After the hearing, Jasmine sat with her team in her office. Darren called her performance flawless. Leah said Clint wasn't looking to be impressed, he was looking to be moved. Marcus, the youngest aide, said it best. He didn't want to hear your resume. He wanted to hear your purpose. Jasmine stayed silent, staring at the wall. In the chamber 2 floors up, Clint met with other candidates, polished, bipartisan, inoffensive. One spoke like a commercial. Another like a eulogy. Clint listened, took no notes. After the last one left, he muttered, "I've seen better acting in B-movies." And then he disappeared. No one knew where he went. He didn't tell anyone. No announcement. No press. Clint Eastwood flew commercial and walked alone into Jasmine's district. South Dallas wasn't a backdrop for a campaign ad. It was raw, alive, scarred. He went to gas stations where pens were still sold for a nickel. To schools with broken HVAC systems. To apartment buildings with elevators that hadn't worked in years. He asked no polling questions. Only, who shows up when no one's looking? At a community center, a janitor named Raphael said, "She comes here every month. Picks up trash like the rest of us." At a school, a teacher showed him letters Jasmine had written to kids after a local debate win. At a housing complex, a mother named Desiree said, when the landlord cut the heat, she brought space heaters door to door. In the rain, Clint took no notes, but inside, something cracked open. Not admiration. Recognition. 2 days later, it dropped. Grainy cell phone footage. A college protest. Jasmine, 19 years old. Shouting. Protecting a fallen student. Police moving in. Zip ties. A concrete sidewalk. Her face pressed down, her voice still loud. No context. Just enough to judge. The headlines followed. Crockett caught on camera. Is this leadership? Unfit. Unstable. Unapologetic. They ignored the protest was peaceful. They ignored the charges had been dropped. They ignored why she was there. Inside her office, Jasmine watched the footage on repeat. She didn't speak. Leah broke the silence. "They'll try to bury you in this." Jasmine stood. Let them try. That night, she found him in the back of a quiet bar. Clint didn't offer a greeting. Just nodded toward the glass poured for her. She sat. "I'm not sorry," she said. He didn't blink. "I was 19. I wasn't angry. I was tired. Tired of silence. Tired of children dying and no one noticing." Her voice cracked, but her hands stayed still. "You ever been tired, Clint?" He nodded slowly. "That's when leaders are born," he said. "Not when it's safe. When it's too damn heavy to carry, and you lift anyway." The next morning, the party called. They wanted her to withdraw, gracefully. They had someone else in mind. A safer candidate. A quieter one. Jasmine didn't cry. She didn't rage. She hung up. Leah looked at her across the room. "They think you've become the story." Jasmine replied, "No, they're just afraid I've become the mirror." Clint Eastwood did something he hadn't done in decades. He requested a public hearing. The committee room was packed. Not with reporters but with expectation. He stood at the podium. "I came back to Washington because I was tired of watching people mistake silence for wisdom." He looked directly at the 12 members. "Jasmine Crockett may not be the safest choice. But she is the right one." No applause. Just breath held too long. He turned, walked out, and left the room shaking behind him. The hearing chamber was colder than usual. Not the kind of cold that came from air conditioning, but the kind that seeped in through walls thick with history and hesitation. A chill that settled into the skin and stayed there, no matter how long you sat. Jasmine Crockett sat upright, her spine a line of quiet resistance. She wore no campaign color, no power red or cautious navy. Just black, simple, sharp, grounded. Her hands were folded in her lap, fingers unmoving except for the occasional tremor she fought to still. Across the room, 12 committee members shifted in their seats. Some glanced her way with rehearsed neutrality. Others avoided eye contact entirely. And in the center of it all, Clint Eastwood sat motionless. One leg crossed, his cane resting by the chair, his expression unreadable, an old oak tree in the middle of a gathering storm. The cameras were rolling. The air buzzed with whispered commentary and the steady scratch of reporters' pens. But Jasmine wasn't focused on any of it. She was listening to the sound of her breath, to the silence between the notes, the space where truth waited to be heard. Then the chairperson leaned forward and spoke the words that shifted the energy in the room. "We will now proceed to the final vote." There were no speeches, no final appeals, just names and answers, one by one. "Senator Adams? Nay." A pause. A scribble on paper. "Senator Brooks? Aye." The rhythm continued, deliberate, judicial. Every response was a needle tilting the balance. "Representative Chen? Aye." "Representative Delgado? Nay." 6 names in, and it was tied. 3-3. Jasmine could feel her heartbeat not just in her chest, but in her ears, in her fingertips. It wasn't fear. It was weight. The kind that builds when your story is being judged not by those who lived it with you, but by those who watched from safe distances. "Senator Walsh? Nay." The edge tipped. Behind Jasmine, Leah exhaled sharply. 7 names down. 5 remained. "Representative Fields? Aye." "Senator Harper? Nay." 4-5. The next name made the room still. "Senator Thompson?" He didn't answer right away. The pause stretched long enough that someone in the back cleared their throat. Thompson, a moderate known for hedging, looked down at the table in front of him as if the answer had been etched into the grain of the wood. Then he said it, voice soft but steady. "Aye." 5-5. 2 left. Jasmine felt the weight shift in the room, not the outcome, but the perception. The inevitability of dismissal had fractured. Hope, fragile but real, returned to the air like breath. "Representative Vaughn?" The pause wasn't long. "Nay." 6-5. 1 name left. Senator Glenn Ramsey. He was the oldest on the panel. A man who had once marched with his father in Selma, but who had spent the last 2 decades playing the game like it was chess, not conscience. He had said nothing throughout the hearings. Not a question, not a comment, just silence wrapped in civility. Now, all eyes turned to him. He looked across the room. Not at Jasmine, not at the cameras, at Clint Eastwood. And Clint, for the first time, gave a visible signal. A slight nod, no smile, no plea, just recognition, the kind that said, "We both know what this is." Ramsey's lips parted. The word took a moment to emerge. The room didn't cheer. It didn't explode. It exhaled. Jasmine didn't smile. Not yet. Not with cameras still watching and history still catching up. The chairperson cleared her throat. By a vote of 7-5, the committee moves to advance Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett to consideration for the open Senate seat. Leah touched her arm lightly. Jasmine nodded, almost imperceptibly. But the storm behind her eyes had passed. And in its place, something else. Resolve. She stood, not fast, not triumphant. Just straight. Clint was already standing too. They didn't shake hands. They didn't embrace. But as she passed by him, he met her gaze. "You earned it," he said quietly. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Because in that moment, in that quiet exchange amid the marble and microphones, everything had already been said. Jasmine Crockett wasn't the perfect candidate. She was the necessary one. And for the first time in a long time, a room full of power had finally said yes to someone who didn't come asking politely. She came carrying truth, and she left with history on her heels. The vote was cast. The chamber had spoken, but the real reckoning came in the hours that followed. Outside the Capitol, the sky had turned the color of steel. A winter sun hovered behind a gauze of clouds, softening the outlines of the city but not its energy. Washington wasn't celebrating, it was recalibrating. Newsrooms scrambled. Political strategists texted each other in caps. Talk show panels reshuffled their guest lists. And across the country, screens lit up with a headline that had, until this moment, felt unthinkable. Jasmine Crockett advances to the Senate floor. Inside her office, Jasmine stood at the window, her arms crossed, shoulders relaxed but gaze focused. She wasn't smiling. Not yet. Not because she lacked joy, but because she knew better. She knew what came next. Behind her, Leah was on the phone coordinating responses with press outlets. Darren paced back and forth reciting potential talking points, trying to choose between "history made" and "a new era begins." Marcus had tears in his eyes, half laughing, half stunned. "They didn't think you'd get this far," he said. Jasmine turned. "Neither did half my own party." There was no bitterness in her voice. Just clarity. Leah hung up and looked at her. "It's starting." "What is?" Jasmine asked, though she already knew. "The backlash." Leah stepped forward and handed her a tablet. It was already everywhere. Op-eds warning of extremism, cable news hosts muttering about optics and respectability, memes that twisted her college protest photo into something menacing. One Republican senator had already gone on air and called her confirmation a disaster dressed up as diversity. And a former Democratic strategist tweeted, "This is what happens when you let TikTok pick your leaders." But beneath all the noise, a different current began to rise. Clips from her hearing speech went viral. Again, this time, subtitled in Spanish, Korean, Portuguese. Teenagers on TikTok reenacted her words like monologues. Teachers printed her quotes and stapled them to bulletin boards. Faith leaders referenced her resolve in Sunday sermons. Mothers posted messages that read, "I told my daughter she could lead. Today, I showed her." In Atlanta, a muralist began painting her silhouette against a city wall. One hand raised not in victory but in testimony. In Detroit, students walked out of class wearing shirts with her quote, "I'm not perfect. I'm present." In New York, subway riders looked up from their phones as a busker read aloud her words into the mic between stations. It wasn't just a political victory. It was a cultural flashpoint. And Jasmine? She stayed quiet through most of it. No press tour, no victory lap, just a short post on social media, typed in her own voice without filters. "Thank you to everyone who saw me. The real me. This isn't the end of the story. It's the start of a very long, very necessary chapter. I won't waste the moment. I promise you that." Still, not everyone was pleased. Behind closed doors in think tanks and donor galas, the whispers thickened. She's going to be a problem. She's not safe. She doesn't owe us. That makes her dangerous. And yet, even in that discomfort, something unspoken stirred. Respect. Because Jasmine Crockett had not only passed the test, she had rewritten it. At home in South Dallas, the streets buzzed. People cheered outside barbershops and churches. A bakery renamed its red velvet cupcakes Crockett Courage. Neighborhood kids chalked her name onto sidewalks. Elders who had stopped voting years ago stopped to watch her hearing replay on corner TVs. And in one quiet living room, a young girl named Maya sat beside her mother, clutching a notebook. "I want to be like her," Maya whispered. Her mother smiled gently. "Then start now." Maya scribbled something at the top of the page. "Show up, even if they don't want you there." In the Capitol, Clint Eastwood returned to the room where it had all unfolded. The cameras were gone now. The air still. He ran a hand across the surface of the table, solid oak, worn by decades of decisions. He didn't speak, didn't smile, but in his chest, something settled. He had done what he came to do. And she? She was just getting started. The doors to the Senate chamber opened with a weight that was more than physical. Every hinge, every inch of polished brass, seemed to groan under the pressure of tradition and transformation. Jasmine Crockett stepped forward, slowly, steadily, into a space that had, until now, existed only as shadow and symbol in her life. Her heels touched the marble like a drumbeat, measured, intentional. She wore no bright colors. No designer label stitched across her back. Just a dark navy suit, a white blouse, and a pin over her heart. An heirloom passed down from her grandmother, a nurse who had been denied a vote but taught her what dignity looked like in silence. The chamber was not full, but it was watching. Every senator in the room knew what her presence meant. Not just the confirmation of a new colleague, but the arrival of something they couldn't quite name. A challenge to a rhythm they'd mastered. A disruption of an ecosystem built to reward consensus over conscience. Some nodded politely. Some avoided eye contact. A few smiled with sincerity. But none could ignore her. As she approached her desk, one newly carved plaque reading, "Senator Jasmine Crockett," shining under the overhead light, she paused, then placed a small, folded piece of paper atop it. It was a letter, not to herself. To the girl she had once been. The girl in the protest video. The girl with zip ties on her wrists. The girl whose voice shook but didn't stop. "You were right to stand," it read. "Now sit in what you've earned." She took her seat, not nervously, not triumphantly, just fully, like the chair had never been meant for anyone else. Outside, the press was gathering. Not just political correspondents, but cultural writers, international journalists, young freelancers looking for a glimpse of the moment America might start to look a little more like the people who lived in it. But Jasmine didn't walk back out. She stayed at her desk and began her work. The first act she submitted was a bill titled the Foundation Act, a sweeping reform package aimed at funding neglected schools, infrastructure in underserved communities, and maternal health care access for Black and brown mothers. It was bold, expensive, ambitious. The headlines read, "Senator Crockett wastes no time. The maverick rises, from protest to policy." But inside the halls, the response was mixed. Some colleagues approached her with cautious admiration. "Strong first step," one senator said. Another whispered, "Careful, the bigger the change, the sharper the knives." Jasmine smiled, not out of smugness, but because she had heard that before. They had told her not to speak at protests. Then not to run for city council. Then not to push bills that wouldn't go anywhere. But every no had only carved a sharper yes inside her. That evening, in her new office, Jasmine sat at her desk alone. A box of belongings waited to be unpacked. Family photos. A framed letter from her law school professor. A tiny plaque that read, "Do it anyway." The Capitol lights twinkled through the window behind her. There was no applause, no cameras, just the sound of her breath, steady and soft. She reached into her bag and pulled out the note Clint had passed her at the end of the vote. She unfolded it again, reading his final words. Don't become what they accept. Stay what they need. She tucked it into the top drawer. And then she began to write. Not a speech, a blueprint, because the seat had never been about decoration or power. It had always been about direction. And Jasmine was ready to lead. The walls of power don't always crack from the outside. Sometimes, the first fire starts inside. Jasmine Crockett had been a senator for 41 days when the first resistance came. Not from across the aisle, but from within her own party. It began quietly, like most betrayals do. A conversation without her, behind a closed door. A committee hearing delayed without explanation. A sentence removed from a draft bill she'd worked on all night. Tiny cuts, barely visible, but she felt them. One morning, her policy lead, Marcus, knocked softly and entered her office, his tablet in hand and his face tight with apology. They're reassigning oversight of your education bill, he said. Jasmine looked up slowly. To who? He hesitated. Senator Whitman. She didn't speak at first. Didn't move, but her stillness was louder than fury. Whitman was a moderate, polished, safe, the kind of senator who prided himself on bipartisan achievements, many of which were so diluted by compromise they accomplished little but good headlines. Jasmine stood up and walked to the window, arms crossed. They're trying to fence me in, she said. Marcus nodded. They're saying you're too ambitious. Moving too fast. She let out a short, bitter breath. I didn't come here to tiptoe. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. That afternoon, she requested a one-on-one meeting with Senator Whitman. It was granted, cordially, efficiently, like a formality. They met in his corner office where the walls were lined with framed articles and honorary degrees. Senator Crockett, he said, standing to shake her hand. It's good to finally sit down with you directly. Let's skip the choreography, Jasmine said, taking her seat without smiling. You took my bill. Whitman blinked, then chuckled. I was asked to step in. There were concerns about optics. The party's trying to present a unified front. A front without the people behind it? She asked. He leaned back, fingers steepled. You have passion, Jasmine. No one doubts that, but there's a rhythm to this chamber. Change comes slow, and if you move too fast, you risk losing allies. Jasmine didn't blink. If you have to slow down truth to keep friends, maybe they were never your allies to begin with. The conversation ended with polite farewells. But the line had been drawn. The next day, Jasmine stood before a coalition of young senators and staffers, progressives, independents, and a few quiet conservatives with open minds. The room buzzed with curiosity. Some had come in support. Others came out of skepticism. All of them came because Jasmine had asked them to. She stood without notes. I didn't come here to be palatable, she began. I came to be useful. A murmur rippled through the room. Useful means uncomfortable, she continued. It means stepping into spaces that were not made for you and refusing to make yourself smaller to fit. She spoke of the education bill, of her community, of what it meant to see your name removed from legislation you had written with your own hands. But I am not here alone, she said, her voice lifting. Every time they try to quiet me, they wake up 1,000 others who were waiting to speak. By the end of the meeting, 8 senators had signed on to co-sponsor a reintroduced version of her education reform under a new name, the Ground Up Act. The press took notice. The headlines shifted. Crockett gains momentum. New Senate bloc emerges. From outsider to architect. Even Whitman, begrudgingly, issued a statement expressing support. The fire they'd tried to extinguish had spread, and it was illuminating the halls in ways Washington hadn't seen in years. One weekend in June, Jasmine flew home. No cameras, no fanfare, just her, a carry-on bag, and her old friend Rosa waiting at baggage claim with a "Welcome home, Senator Crockett" sign scribbled in Sharpie on a pizza box. They laughed like they always had. Feels different now? Rosa asked as they drove through South Dallas. Not the city, Jasmine said, but the way people look at me in it. They passed the corner store where Jasmine had handed out water bottles during heat waves. The shelter where she had defended eviction cases pro bono. The elementary school with the broken playground slide still duct taped together. At a local town hall that Sunday, Jasmine stood in a high school gym, under the buzz of fluorescent lights, in front of 200 people who had once voted for her, argued with her, prayed for her, or all three. She didn't speak like a senator. She spoke like their neighbor. "Nothing I do in D.C. means a damn thing if it doesn't touch here," she said. And they believed her, not because of her words, but because they remembered her before the Senate pin. Back in Washington, a new hallway was under construction, a symbolic space meant to honor emerging leaders in public service. It was supposed to feature portraits of senators, bipartisan champions, unsung heroes of legislation. Jasmine's name had been floated for inclusion, and then quietly removed. Clint Eastwood called her one morning from his ranch. "They say it's too soon," he said. Jasmine laughed. "Too soon for what?" "For truth that doesn't ask for permission." They spoke for 15 minutes, longer than usual. He didn't offer advice this time. He just listened, and when he hung up, Jasmine knew he was still watching. Weeks later, during a floor debate on prison reform, a senator across the aisle launched into a tirade. "Maybe if some of our colleagues spent less time chasing headlines and more time understanding real law enforcement, we wouldn't be stuck debating fantasy bills." He didn't name her. He didn't have to. Jasmine rose. Not angrily. Not loudly. She began with a story. About a 16-year-old boy in her district who had been arrested for defending his sister from an abusive stepfather, and who had spent 3 years in detention waiting for a trial that never came. He didn't need a lecture, she said. He needed justice. The room fell quiet. Even those prepared to vote against her bill couldn't meet her eyes. By morning, 5 votes had flipped. The bill passed committee. Months passed. The work didn't get easier. But Jasmine had learned how to carry the weight without letting it wear her down. One afternoon, she received a letter. Handwritten. Postmarked from a small town in West Virginia. It read, "Dear Senator Crockett, I never thought I'd write to someone like you. We don't look the same. We don't vote the same. But I watched you during that hearing, the one with the old guy, Eastwood. You didn't flinch, and something about that made me think, maybe we don't need leaders who always say what we want. Maybe we need leaders who say what we need. I'm voting for the first time in 20 years. Because of you." Jasmine folded the letter slowly, then placed it in the top drawer of her desk, beside the note from Clint. And she whispered, "One at a time is enough to keep going." Years later, on the anniversary of her swearing in, Jasmine sat alone in the chamber. It was early. The room was empty. The light was soft. She looked around, not with pride, but with perspective. This seat was still here. Still hers. Not because she had shouted the loudest, but because she had stayed the longest. Outside, the world was still hard. Still divided. Still unsure. But inside, the fire still burned. Quiet. Steady. Unshakable. Because in the end, history isn't written by those who enter the room. It's written by those who remain. When it's no longer easy, when no one is watching, when the echoes are louder than the applause. And Jasmine Crockett? She remained. This story is not about one woman. It's about every person who has ever been told to wait their turn. Every leader who wasn't invited to the table, but built their own. Every voice that wasn't polished, perfect, or polite, but rang true. It is a reminder. Power may reside in the marble of institutions, but truth lives in the persistence of those who refuse to be forgotten. Thank you for staying to the end. Now go create your beginning.